The winter rain hammered against the windows of Supreme Headquarters in Versailles as General Dwight Eisenhower stared at the urgent cable in his hands. It was March 24, 1945. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was pressing him hard about George S. Patton, demanding discipline, possibly even removal from command. The reason? Patton had done the impossible, crossing the Rhine River in less than 2 days with minimal preparation, beating Montgomery's meticulously planned operation by a full day. What should have been celebrated as a military triumph had instead ignited one of the most explosive confrontations of World War II. Eisenhower crushed out his cigarette and leaned back in his chair. He'd dealt with these two brilliant, infuriating commanders for years now, but this situation was different. The war was nearly won, yet here he was, trapped between two massive egos that threatened to tear apart the Allied command structure at the worst possible moment. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the three men at the heart of this crisis, and how their paths had been colliding since the beaches of North Africa. George Patton was born to be a warrior. The grandson of a Confederate colonel, he'd spent his entire life preparing for battle. He read military history obsessively, studied ancient campaigns, and believed with absolute certainty that he'd fought in previous wars as a Roman legionnaire and a soldier under Napoleon. His pearl-handled revolvers weren't just for show. They were extensions of a man who saw warfare as the ultimate test of human will. By 1945, Patton commanded the Third Army, and his record was staggering. While other Allied forces measured their advances in miles per week, Patton's tanks swept across hundreds of miles in days. He was aggressive to the point of recklessness, driving his men with profane tirades and impossible demands. His soldiers cursed his name and followed him anywhere. They knew that when Patton attacked, victories came fast and casualties stayed low because speed and audacity kept the enemy off balance. But Patton was also a diplomatic nightmare. He'd already been nearly fired twice. Once for slapping shell-shocked soldiers in Sicily, calling them cowards while they recovered in field hospitals. Then again for suggesting that America and Britain should rearm the Germans and immediately attack the Soviet Union. Eisenhower had saved his career both times, but barely. Now, with the Rhine crossing, Patton had given his enemies fresh ammunition. Bernard Montgomery was everything Patton wasn't. Methodical where Patton was impulsive, cautious where Patton was bold. The British Field Marshal planned his operations with the precision of a watchmaker, accumulating overwhelming superiority before attacking. His critics called him timid. His defenders pointed to his victories. El Alamein in North Africa. The careful pursuit across Sicily and Italy. He rarely lost battles because he rarely fought them unless victory was mathematically certain. Montgomery was also supremely confident in his own genius. He kept a photo of Rommel in his command caravan, not out of respect, but to remind himself he'd beaten the legendary Desert Fox. He lectured other generals like a schoolmaster correcting slow students. American commanders, he believed, were enthusiastic amateurs who'd gotten lucky. The British had been fighting this war since 1939. They knew how things should be done. The animosity between Patton and Montgomery had been building for years. In Sicily in 1943, they'd practically raced each other to Messina, with Montgomery convinced he deserved the glory and Patton determined to prove American arms were second to none. After D-Day, their rivalry intensified. Montgomery thought he should command all Allied ground forces. Patton thought Montgomery was a pompous has-been whose best days were behind him. Eisenhower stood in the middle, and his position was more political than military. He wasn't just a general. He was the glue holding together an alliance that was constantly threatening to crack. The British military establishment viewed Americans as upstart newcomers. American commanders resented British condescension and what they saw as outdated tactics. Every day, Eisenhower had to balance American interests, British pride, French sensitivities, and the egos of a dozen prima donna generals. He'd chosen Patton and Montgomery precisely because they were brilliant, even if they were impossible to manage. The question was always the same. How much genius was worth how much aggravation? By March 1945, that question was about to be answered. The Rhine River was Germany's last major natural barrier. Behind it lay the industrial Ruhr Valley and the road to Berlin. Every German soldier knew that if the Rhine was crossed, the war was effectively over. So they defended it with desperate ferocity, blowing every bridge, fortifying every town on the eastern bank. Montgomery had been planning his Rhine crossing for months. Operation Plunder would be the largest river assault since D-Day. He'd assembled over 1 million men, thousands of artillery pieces, and complete air superiority. The crossing would be preceded by the biggest airborne drop since Normandy. Everything would be coordinated down to the minute. There would be no room for error because Montgomery didn't believe in leaving anything to chance. The operation was scheduled for March 24th. Churchill himself was coming to watch. It would be Montgomery's crowning achievement, proof that the methodical British way of war was superior to American improvisation. There was just one problem. George Patton. While Montgomery prepared his elaborate set piece, Patton's Third Army had been grinding through the Eifel region to the south. His orders were to support Montgomery's crossing, to draw German reserves away and prevent reinforcements from moving north. Patton followed his orders in his own way, attacking with such ferocity that the Germans didn't know where to commit their forces. By March 22nd, Patton's troops had reached the Rhine near the town of Oppenheim, south of Mainz. The river was narrower there, less than 1,000 feet across, but it was still a formidable obstacle. Standard military doctrine called for extensive preparation, artillery barrages, smoke screens, engineering support. Patton didn't care about doctrine. He saw an opportunity and took it. On the night of March 22nd, without fanfare or extensive preparation, assault boats from the 5th Infantry Division slipped into the Rhine. German defenders were scattered and disorganized. By dawn on March 23rd, an entire regiment was across. Engineers threw up pontoon bridges. By the end of the day, tanks were rolling into Germany. Patton's crossing had succeeded with remarkable speed, executed in under 48 hours from conception to completion. It cost fewer than 50 casualties. It caught the Germans completely by surprise. And it happened 24 hours before Montgomery's massive, meticulously planned operation was scheduled to begin. When Patton called Eisenhower to report his success, he couldn't resist. According to those who heard the conversation, he made sure Eisenhower understood exactly what he'd accomplished. The Third Army had crossed the Rhine without the elaborate preparations that characterized Montgomery's approach. No massive aerial bombardment. No months of planning. Just speed, surprise, and audacity. Every word was a calculated insult aimed at Montgomery's elaborate preparations. Eisenhower, who knew exactly what Patton was doing, understood the game being played. His response was measured, but he couldn't hide a certain satisfaction at what his most aggressive commander had achieved. The news reached Montgomery within hours. He was furious, though he tried to hide it. His carefully staged production had been upstaged by what he considered a minor sideshow. Worse, the American press was already trumpeting Patton's achievement. Headlines screamed about the brilliant general who'd beaten the British to the punch once again. Montgomery's operation went ahead as planned on March 24th. It was a magnificent display of military power. Artillery thundered. Paratroopers dropped from the sky. Amphibious vehicles churned across the water. Churchill watched from a grandstand, delighted by the spectacle. The British and Canadian forces crushed German resistance with overwhelming force. But the magic was gone. Instead of being the first across, Montgomery's crossing was now the second. Journalists compared the two operations. Montgomery's had taken months to plan and utilized over 1 million men. Patton's had been conceived and executed in less than 2 days with a single division. The implication was clear. Which general understood modern mobile warfare? Montgomery's message to Eisenhower was formally polite but seething underneath. Historians still debate exactly how explicit his demand was, but those close to Eisenhower understood the intent clearly. Patton, Montgomery argued, had been insubordinate and had deliberately tried to undermine a major Allied operation. He'd drawn German attention to the south, potentially endangering Montgomery's forces. He'd violated the spirit if not the letter of Eisenhower's coordinated plan. And perhaps most damning, he'd shown the same reckless disregard for proper military procedure that had characterized his entire career. The implication was obvious. Something had to be done about General Patton. Whether Montgomery used the exact words or not, the message was unmistakable. Patton needed to be disciplined, possibly even removed from command and sent home. The Third Army could be given to a more reliable commander who understood the importance of following orders and supporting Allied unity. It wasn't the first time Montgomery had complained about Patton. It wouldn't be the last. But this time felt different. The war was nearly won. Patton's services, however valuable, were becoming less essential. And Eisenhower was exhausted from years of managing these impossible personalities. When the communication arrived, Eisenhower read it carefully, then called in his chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith. Smith knew what was coming. He'd been managing this rivalry for years. "Montgomery wants something done about Patton," Eisenhower said. "Of course he does. He makes some valid points. George did showboat. He knew exactly what he was doing when he crossed before Monty's operation. He also took minimal casualties and put a corps across the Rhine in less than 2 days," Smith replied. "Which is more than Monty can say despite all his preparation." Eisenhower stood and walked to the window. Outside, spring was coming to France. Soon this war would be over. After years of impossible decisions, after the stress of D-Day and the Bulge and 1,000 smaller crises, he was nearly done. But not quite. "The problem," Eisenhower said slowly, "isn't just George or Monty. It's what this represents. If I discipline Patton severely, it tells every American general that British commanders have veto power over their careers. It makes me look weak. But if I ignore Montgomery's complaint, I'm telling the British that American generals can do whatever they want and face no consequences." Smith nodded. He'd seen Eisenhower walk this tightrope before. "There's also the question of whether Monty has a point," Eisenhower continued. "Not about removing George from command, but about his behavior. He did showboat. He's been doing it throughout this campaign. How much of that can I tolerate?" The decision Eisenhower faced went beyond personalities. It was about leadership philosophy, about how you manage brilliant subordinates who are also deeply flawed human beings. It was about alliance politics and American prestige and British pride. And it was about something more fundamental. What kind of general does a democracy need in wartime? Eisenhower spent the rest of that day thinking through his options. He could discipline Patton severely, perhaps even remove him from command. The man had given him enough excuses over the years. This could be the final straw. But then he'd lose his best attacking general right when that kind of aggression was needed most. Germany was collapsing, but it wasn't dead yet. Fierce resistance was still possible, especially if the Nazis made their threatened last stand in the Bavarian Alps. He could publicly reprimand Patton, satisfying Montgomery while keeping his most aggressive commander. But that would humiliate Patton and potentially break the fighting spirit that made him so effective. Patton led from ego and pride. Wound that pride, and you might wound his effectiveness. He could ignore Montgomery's complaint entirely, but that risked a genuine breach with the British. Montgomery commanded enormous prestige in Britain. He was a national hero, knighted by the king, beloved by his troops. If he felt his concerns were dismissed, it would create a political crisis that could reach Churchill and Roosevelt. Or he could try something else entirely. Over the next 2 days, Eisenhower crafted his response. According to those who worked with him, it was a masterpiece of diplomatic maneuvering, saying everything and nothing at the same time. He began by praising Montgomery's operation, making clear that Operation Plunder was a magnificent achievement executed with precision and power. The British and Canadian forces, he emphasized, had broken through formidable German defenses and secured a vital bridgehead. This was an outstanding success that would be studied by military historians for generations. Then he turned to Patton's crossing. He acknowledged that it had been executed with remarkable speed and had achieved complete surprise. However, he framed it as part of the overall Allied plan to cross the Rhine at multiple points, keeping German forces off balance. Patton's crossing, far from undermining Montgomery's operation, had actually supported it by drawing German reserves south. The fact that it occurred before Montgomery's assault was due to opportunistic leadership, which was exactly what Eisenhower expected from his commanders. As for the rivalry between the two men, Eisenhower made clear that he expected all his commanders to focus on defeating Germany, not on competing with each other for glory. He would not tolerate deliberate attempts to undermine fellow Allied commanders. However, he also would not punish aggressive action that achieved military objectives at minimal cost. The message to Montgomery was unmistakable. Patton wasn't getting removed from command. Not today, not for this. But Eisenhower was subtly reminding both men that he was in charge, and their personal animosity needed to stay subordinate to winning the war. He concluded with a stroke of genius. He announced that both Montgomery and Patton would have crucial roles in the final defeat of Germany. Montgomery's 21st Army Group would drive toward the North German Plain and the Baltic. Patton's Third Army would sweep through Bavaria and into Czechoslovakia. Both operations were vital. Both generals would have their chance for glory. By framing it this way, Eisenhower made it impossible for Montgomery to continue pressing his case without appearing petty. He'd given the British general everything he wanted except Patton's head on a platter. The response from Montgomery was frosty but accepting. He'd made his point. Eisenhower had acknowledged his concerns. The matter, Montgomery indicated, was closed. Patton's response was more typical of his character. When Eisenhower's chief of staff called to inform him of the decision, Patton erupted with relief and profanity in equal measure. According to those who were there, he had choice words about his British rival. But then he turned serious and assured Eisenhower's staff that he wouldn't cause any more headaches. They had Germans to kill. It was a promise Patton couldn't quite keep. In the final weeks of the war, he'd clash with Eisenhower again over whether to drive for Prague or Berlin. But the Rhine crisis was over. The alliance had held. The war would continue. In retrospect, Eisenhower's handling of this crisis that March was about more than managing egos. It reflected a fundamental understanding of leadership that would serve him well when he later became president. He knew that great organizations need different kinds of people. They need cautious planners like Montgomery, who minimize risk and ensure resources aren't wasted. They need aggressive attackers like Patton, who see opportunities others miss and exploit them ruthlessly. And they need leaders like Eisenhower himself, who can harness both types and keep them pointed at the enemy rather than each other. The rivalry between Patton and Montgomery never really ended. After the war, Montgomery would write memoirs that barely mentioned American contributions to victory. Patton died in a car accident in December 1945, still dreaming of future wars. But in the spring of 1945, when it mattered most, Eisenhower kept them both in harness and used their competitive fire to drive the final destruction of Nazi Germany. The Rhine crossings, both Montgomery's and Patton's, broke the back of German resistance in the West. Within 6 weeks, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Years later, military historians would debate which crossing was more significant. Montgomery's supporters point to the strategic importance of his bridgehead and the overwhelming force that guaranteed success. Patton's admirers note the speed, efficiency, and minimal casualties of his operation. The truth is that both were needed. Montgomery's methodical approach secured vital objectives with certainty. Patton's opportunistic aggression kept enemies off balance and exploited fleeting chances. But the real story isn't about military tactics. It's about leadership under impossible conditions. Eisenhower faced a choice that had no perfect answer. Severely discipline Patton, and he loses his best attacker while appearing weak to American commanders. Keep Patton without consequence, and he encourages insubordination while insulting British allies. Publicly reprimand Patton, and he might break the very aggression that makes him valuable. So Eisenhower chose a fourth path. He acknowledged everyone's concerns, praised everyone's achievements, subtly warned against future grandstanding, and moved forward. He turned a potential crisis into a non-event through sheer force of diplomatic skill. When Montgomery pressed Eisenhower about Patton after the lightning-fast Rhine crossing, Eisenhower's response made clear he wouldn't remove his most aggressive commander. But he said it in a way that made Montgomery feel heard, Patton feel supported, and the alliance feel secure. That's not the answer that makes for dramatic headlines. It doesn't fit neatly into leadership seminars. It's messy and political and leaves everyone slightly unsatisfied. It's also exactly what the moment required. And that, more than any battle or campaign, is why Dwight Eisenhower was the right man to lead the Allied coalition to victory. He understood that managing genius is harder than being a genius, and that sometimes the most important decisions are the ones that keep brilliant, difficult people working together toward a common goal. The Rhine was crossed. Germany was defeated. The alliance held. In the end, that's all that mattered.